Imagine a scene that is, well, now almost entirely extinct. It's a Sunday morning, and there's a crowd of people just patiently standing in line outside a small storefront. And inside, you see this row of wooden booths, right? Separated by thick glass where people are kind of half shouting, trying to bridge thousands of miles of distance.
Right, the Wartel.
Yeah.
The public telephone exchange.
Exactly. This wasn't some dystopian film set. This was the communication temple of my youth, the Wartel. And waiting to call a relative in a distant city, it felt like this critical mission of state.
I remember that feeling. The duration was so short.
So brief, and the cost was punishing. Every single second felt utterly sacred. We might only speak for 5 minutes, but strangely, those 5 minutes were enough. They were sufficient to sustain that emotional connection for a whole week.
It was intentional. You had to be present for it.
You had to be. Now, just consider the dramatic contrast today. We carry this miracle in our pocket, a device that allows for free video calls, instant messaging, endless nonstop digital presence.
On paper, we should be the most connected humans in history.
We should be. But, ironically, why does it feel right now like the world is just more noisy and, more empty?
Yeah.
This radical shift from waiting patiently in a quiet phone booth to living in a world that's perpetually buzzing with notifications, it leaves us with one deeply disturbing question.
Which is?
Has this convenience of signal truly brought us closer, or has it robbed us of the one luxury we once held so dear? The luxury of productive silence.
That's a powerful way to frame it.
Welcome to the deep dive. I think that opening hook perfectly frames the paradox we're exploring today. The shift from, the scarcity of signal, where a 5-minute phone call was sacred and intentional, to today's hyper-connectivity.
Where we're just drowning in data. We're constantly available, yet often feeling, like you said, completely disconnected and just exhausted.
And the challenge laid out in that memory, that's really our mission for this deep dive. We are trying to move beyond nostalgia here to rigorously examine what has been fundamentally lost.
And what's being actively threatened.
Exactly. What's threatened by this jump from minimal to instant communication in a place like Indonesian society. And we're going to focus on 2 critical arenas, both backed by some fascinating research: individual mental well-being and the structural strength of our community bonds.
And what's so essential about the sources we've gathered is that they give us a kind of quantified roadmap. We can trace the path from that deeply personal psychological strain all the way to the broadly cultural erosion of trust.
Okay, so where do we start on that map?
We'll start by looking at the hard data behind digital exhaustion, particularly in urban centers. We need to understand the intense mental costs of this always-on culture.
And from there?
Then we pivot. We pivot sharply to the communal level, the struggle to maintain traditional social solidarity, a concept that's really epitomized by the foundational Indonesian value of Gotong Royong.
Mutual support.
Mutual support, exactly. And we'll see how that plays out in rural areas where technology is sort of hybridizing these old ways of living and interacting.
And finally,
we're going to examine instances of outright resistance, intentional limitation. We'll look at communities that have deliberately restricted digital access.
Yeah.
In some cases, they've actually successfully asked the government for a complete internet blackout.
Wow.
Yeah, as a necessary strategic measure for cultural and, personal survival. This is the deep dive into the true, often hidden price of that instant signal.
Okay, let's unpack this right now by addressing that personal cost. The weight of endless notifications on our collective mental state. I mean, we know Indonesia is one of the world's most hyper-connected nations.
The numbers are staggering.
They really are. The sheer volume of active social media users, we're talking 191.4 million back in 2022. That kind of exponential growth translates directly into a high-frequency, always-on culture.
Which naturally generates massive psychological strain.
Right. And that anxiety you mentioned earlier, that feeling of panic if you delay a reply by even a few minutes, that's the symptom, isn't it?
It's a symptom of the digital world completely eliminating the natural boundaries we used to have. I mean, think about it. When the sun went down, communication, for the most part, it stopped.
The day was over.
The day was over. Now there are no sanctioned rest periods.
Right.
And we can actually quantify that feeling of emptiness and noise using some really solid academic frameworks.
This brings us to the core mechanism of digital burnout, the stressor-strain outcome model, the SSO model. It's used to understand social media fatigue. So walk us through the anatomy of that model.
Sure. The SSO model provides a really clean 3-step psychological pathway. The first step is the stressor.
The stressor.
Right. And this is the measurable intensity and frequency of your social media use itself. So how many hours you spend on the platform, how often you check it, how actively you engage. This high-intensity use is the input.
Okay, so that's what you do.
Exactly. Then the stressor, in turn, leads directly to the strain. This is the crucial mediating step, and it's defined as information overload.
Information overload.
Information overload. It occurs when the sheer volume, the complexity, and the speed of the content you're facing exceeds your inherent cognitive capacity to process it. The constant barrage of updates, opinions, news alerts, personal stories, it just overwhelms the brain's filtering mechanisms.
So it's not just that I'm looking at the screen for hours, it's that my brain is being forced into this frantic, high-intensity processing work just to figure out what matters and what doesn't constantly.
That's it. It's cognitive exhaustion, not just eye strain.
I see.
And that strain, that intense information overload, then leads to the final step.
Yeah.
The outcome.
Which is social media fatigue.
Precisely. And this is a really profound state of burnout. It's defined not just as feeling tired, but as a multidimensional subjective experience. It includes feelings of disappointment, frustration, anger, boredom.
A loss of interest.
A huge decrease in motivation regarding using the platform. It's that feeling of wanting to disengage, but feeling like you can't.
And when we look specifically at Indonesian users, which group is the most susceptible to this quantified fatigue? The data seems to point a finger squarely at emerging adulthood, specifically those aged 18 to 25.
That cohort is under extraordinary pressure. They represent over 30% of social media users overall in the country. And their saturation is even higher on platforms like Instagram, where they account for something like 37.2% of users.
And for this age group, Instagram is foundational.
It's everything. It's the primary venue for socializing, for exploring, expressing your identity, and for rapidly seeking information. So because they rely on it so heavily, any negative psychological pathway is it's amplified.
So let's drill down into the study's central finding on information overload, because this feels like where the deep dive really starts to differentiate the cause from the symptom. The research reveals that overload is the real engine here. It acts as a complete mediator. What does that mean in practical terms?
This is maybe the most significant methodological insight from the work we looked at. It means that when researchers analyzed the relationship between intensive social media use and fatigue, they found that the direct link, just spending a lot of time on the app leading directly to fatigue, that link was statistically insignificant once they accounted for the cognitive cost.
Wow. So my time spent is the condition, but the information overload is the actual mechanism that causes the burnout.
Exactly. The indirect effect, that path where high-intensity use leads to overload, which then causes fatigue, that pathway accounts for an astonishing 95.21% of the total measured effect.
95%.
Think about that. Almost 95% of your digital burnout is driven by your brain failing to cope with the sheer volume and complexity of the data, not just the physical act of scrolling. Overload is the single primary mechanism connecting your habits to your burnout.
That completely reframes the entire discussion around digital wellness, doesn't it? We're constantly told to limit our screen time, but the core problem, according to this data, is what we are allowing into our cognitive space while that screen is on.
Right.
If the content is diverse, novel, and complex, then even moderate usage can be cripplingly exhausting.
And this is what leads us to the really surprising nuance of usage duration. It shows how the platform itself, through its algorithmic design, can inadvertently change that cognitive cost. The analysis looked at users broken down by hours per day.
Okay.
And they found that the complete mediation effect, that pathway where overload causes fatigue, was consistently and powerfully strong for users spending between 1 and 4 hours on Instagram.
Wait, that's counterintuitive. I would logically expect the person spending 5, 7, or 8 hours a day to be the most cognitively overwhelmed. Why do the moderate users seem to be disproportionately struggling with this overload fatigue?
It's a fantastic question. And the data suggests that for the very high-duration users, those spending 5 hours or more, a subtle protective mechanism kicks in. It actually weakens or even makes the overload effect statistically insignificant for them.
A protective mechanism.
We have to hypothesize a bit about why, but the research points pretty clearly to content diversity and algorithmic tailoring.
Okay, explain that. What is algorithmic protection?
Well, the moderate user, the person spending maybe 1 to 4 hours a day, is likely engaged in a more diverse range of activities. They're actively seeking new information, following a broader range of accounts, maybe encountering novel content before the platform has fully, optimized their feed.
I see.
This diversity, this complexity and novelty, it significantly increases the cognitive effort required to process, to understand, and to separate relevant facts from irrelevant noise. They are, in effect, fighting a fire hose of information.
Ah, so they are in a state of continuous high-effort filtering and decision-making.
Precisely. They're still actively exploring. In contrast, the sources suggest that the very high-duration users, the ones spending 5+ hours a day, are operating almost entirely within a highly tailored algorithmic bubble.
Right.
The platform feeds them content that is extremely familiar, highly personalized, less diverse, and, frankly, easier to digest. It might strictly align with their existing biases, or it may simply be low-novelty entertainment, like continuous, highly specialized gaming streams or personal vlogs about topics they already know inside and out.
So their content is so personalized it becomes repetitive and low effort. They're viewing things that require minimal filtering or critical thinking because the algorithm has already filtered out all the hard stuff for them.
That's the hypothesis. This familiarity drastically reduces the required cognitive effort. So even though their total screen time is far higher, they're insulated from the cognitive processing strain that moderate users experience when they're dealing with complexity and diversity.
So they're still tired.
Oh, there's still fatigue, perhaps, from the duration or the sedentary nature of the activity.
Yeah.
But not necessarily from the overload caused by information complexity and the need to filter.
It's a really ironic feedback loop. The algorithm's goal is to keep you engaged by reducing friction. And in doing so for its most intensive users, it accidentally lowers the cognitive cost of their habit.
And the study confirms it. The higher intensity of use, which is often driven by the need to socialize or gather information, it inevitably leads to this information explosion, a condition where the user lacks the capability to organize and understand the massive inflow of data.
And that culminates in that intense social media fatigue.
It does. And this is why the lesson here is so profound.
Yeah.
Managing the quantity of your connection is in many ways secondary to managing the quality, the complexity, and the intentionality of what you are consuming. The personal cost is not a matter of minutes, it's a matter of mental bandwidth.
Okay, so if the personal cost is so clearly defined by bandwidth, we have to shift our focus from the individual's mind to the community's heart. What does this constant, cheap, high-speed connection do to the structural bonds that hold society together?
Right.
This leads us directly to the waning of social cohesion and the erosion of what researchers call social capital.
Yes, we are moving from psychological capital to social capital. And in Indonesia, the traditional and really foundational structure for collective life is encapsulated in the concept of Gotong Royong.
Which translates literally to mutual support, cooperation.
Collective action, exactly. And this value is absolutely rooted in social trust. If that trust erodes, the ability to perform Gotong Royong, to voluntarily work together for community benefit, it just dissolves along with it.
And what's so disturbing is that the data provides a measurable, statistically significant decline in this fundamental social trust across generations. I mean, this isn't just a feeling of kids these days. We have the numbers from longitudinal studies.
We do. The analysis, drawing from data like the Indonesia Family Life Survey, reveals a clear, consistent downward trend in the level of social trust across the age cohorts. Trust levels were highest in the baby boomer generation.
Those who grew up in the era of limited connectivity and high reliance on personal interaction.
Exactly. And as technology and connectivity grew,
trust plummeted.
It did. This high baseline of trust then declines significantly in Generation X, and it reaches its measurable lowest point among the millennial generation, the first cohort that grew up completely immersed in digital media and hyper-connectivity.
And we aren't just talking about abstract ideas of trust here. This decline is consistent across the core dimensions of community life.
That is a vital point to note. The decrease is observed consistently when you measure trust in neighbors, which is your immediate social circle.
The people right next door.
Right, then trust in people of the same ethnic group, and trust in people of the same religion. In a nation as geographically and culturally diverse as Indonesia, a decline in social trust across ethnic and religious lines is not just a social concern. It significantly increases the potential for intergroup conflict. It reduces the overall stability of the social fabric.
It really feels like the foundational glue of collaboration and shared responsibility is weakening precisely among the generations that have always had instant, free communication at their fingertips. If communication is so easy, why is trust so hard?
Well, the findings strongly support the idea that social capital, defined by those networks of trust and cooperation, is declining. The younger generations who rely on these digital interactions simply have lower levels of trust than their elders who relied on structured, high-friction, face-to-face interaction.
So the digital forms of communication, while they're efficient for logistics,
They are poor substitutes for the relational depth required to generate high levels of trust.
To see this theoretical transformation in action, let's pivot to a rural case study. Wajo Regency in South Sulawesi. In a place where traditions still hold significant sway, how did communication traditionally underpin social solidarity?
Well, in traditional rural settings like Wajo, solidarity is built through these deeply embodied face-to-face interactions that go far beyond just transferring information. The community's essential bonds are fostered during actual collective work, like community service, which is also called Gotong Royong.
Right.
They're also reinforced during formal village meetings and vital religious gatherings like talilan, which are memorial prayers held for the deceased.
So these activities are not just about getting things done efficiently.
Not at all. They are deep, relational, and transformative interactions that intentionally build trust, reinforce shared values, and establish collective responsibility. They mandate presence.
So the communication itself is the social capital because it requires effort, presence, and a shared vulnerability. It's the ritualized interaction that strengthens the connection, not just the content of the message being sent.
Absolutely. One community leader's quote was so revealing. He emphasized that when the villagers gather for Gotong Royong, it's not only about the physical work, it's a mandated space to reconnect, to discuss ongoing issues, and most importantly, to ensure that everyone feels included and valued.
I see.
This regularity and this intention ensure that face-to-face communication remains the central pillar of cohesion. It allows the community to overcome challenges collectively through shared effort and accountability.
But this robust traditional system must now operate in a really challenging hybrid environment, balancing the old ways with modern digital tools. What specific complexities and fractures does this blending introduce into a rural context?
It creates a fascinating but sometimes unstable blend. Digital tools, particularly WhatsApp groups, have been adopted because they are undeniably efficient for coordination and swift alerts.
Sharing news about meeting times, local disasters, mobilizing resources quickly.
All of that. However, the community leaders are explicit about this. They recognize that the real work, the collective decision-making, the resolution of conflict, that still absolutely requires traditional face-to-face meetings.
So the digital tool acts as an enhancer for logistics, but it can't replace the personal interactions that generate that high-stakes trust.
It can't. And the challenge is maintaining this precarious balance.
And that balance is immediately complicated by the technological disparities that are just inherent in rural development.
Yes, the sources highlight major issues around the digital and literacy divide. Limited technological infrastructure, like unreliable internet service, means that information dissemination is frequently slowed down or fractured. In areas with poor 4G, the community must still heavily rely on traditional word of mouth for critical information.
Which is slow, especially during an urgent crisis.
Incredibly slow. And furthermore, low digital literacy is a widespread problem. Many elders, the traditional holders of power and knowledge, they struggle to access or correctly interpret digitally conveyed information, which limits inclusive dialogue.
And that generational gap we observed in the national trust data, it must manifest practically here, creating conflicts between the traditional power structures and the new digital natives.
It absolutely does. Conflicts arise between older members who insist on the primacy of traditional in-person forums for all important matters, and the younger members who naturally prefer the speed and interactive nature of digital tools. They see face-to-face meetings as inefficient.
That's a huge source of friction.
It is, and this internal friction is further complicated by linguistic diversity. In a region like Wajo, there are various local dialects spoken. So often, younger people are needed not just to translate the technology to the elders, but to act as language mediators between different dialect groups in the digital space.
That is a critical point. That reliance on the younger, digitally native generation to act as translators of technology, of dialects, of digital culture, it inevitably shifts the internal power dynamics of the village. It gives them a disproportionate influence over the communication processes.
And by extension, collective decision-making. It absolutely changes who controls the narrative. And this whole environment of informal digital communication creates a massive vulnerability that directly attacks trust.
Misinformation.
It's a rapid spread of misinformation and rumors. Just like in urban environments, false claims spread like wildfire through WhatsApp and other informal networks, immediately damaging that fragile social trust required for Gotong Royong.
So how does a traditional community like Rojo fight back against this digital poison?
Their resilience is in returning to human agency. They actively combat misinformation by relying on those traditional high-friction forums, the village meetings, and direct dialogue. When a rumor spreads, community leaders immediately use the established, trusted systems to counter the false claims and reaffirm the facts.
Which demonstrates that the traditional system, while slower, is fundamentally more resilient and trustworthy for high-stakes information than the instant digital network.
Exactly.
This reliance on intentional human intervention to counter digital chaos, it leads us to our final theme. If technology is eroding our bonds and our mental health, resilience must involve proactive, intentional human agency. We have to either adapt the technology with discipline or, well, reject it entirely.
Exactly. We shift now to looking at communities that are intentionally fighting back. But first, I think we need to revisit the core principles of building authentic community resilience in the digital age, which are really the antithesis of a fleeting digital interaction.
The sources suggest that authentic connection demands intentionality, vulnerability, and presence. These are the very elements that constant, low-friction technology strips away.
They are the friction that builds deep bonds. Authentic community requires, first, vulnerability, sharing your genuine struggles and failures, not just the curated successes, which is what builds empathy. Then, active listening. Giving your full empathetic attention without the distraction of a vibrating phone in your pocket, demonstrating respect. Reciprocity, a true exchange of support, both giving and receiving, and perhaps most critically, presence. Being fully engaged, mind and body, in face-to-face interactions.
And these elements, they can't be automated or sped up.
Not at all.
So we need to intentionally reintroduce the effort and the focus that technology was designed to eliminate.
And that leads directly to the principle of ethical technology use. The consensus among the researchers is clear. Technology should only be used as a strategic tool for enhancing connection, managing logistics, coordination, resource sharing, not for replacing the authentic, face-to-face connections that generate deep trust.
Which requires clear, non-negotiable boundaries, mandated, regular periods of digital detox or silence to reclaim that human agency.
Precisely.
This intentionality takes a radical and frankly powerful form when we examine the inner Badu community in West Java. They didn't just set boundaries, they requested a complete internet blackout.
This is a remarkable demonstration of prioritizing cultural sovereignty and self-determination over global technological norms. In June 2023, the leaders of the Inner Bedouin tribe officially requested a complete, immediate internet blackout within their sacred area.
And the government granted the appeal.
The Indonesian government granted the appeal.
What was the primary stated motivation for this decision? Was it just a fear of the unknown, or was it a strategic defense?
It was absolutely a strategic defense, and it was rooted in ethical and cultural preservation.
Well,
their motivation was crystal clear. They viewed the internet as a direct existential threat to their cultural legacy and the moral development of their younger generation.
wow.
They explicitly stated that the existence of phones and smartphones could result in declining morals because they allow immediate access to what they termed non-educating applications and contents.
So they weren't rejecting technology out of ignorance. They were making a calculated choice. They assessed the risk and deemed it too high for their specific cultural context.
Precisely. They were rejecting the internet as a necessity because they understood its potential impact on their distinct identity and their traditional sense of fulfillment, which they derive from the natural environment and their ancestral traditions.
It's a powerful non-Luddite strategy.
It really is. It shows that they recognize that fulfillment is not found in connectivity, but in preserving their way of life and their cultural identity. And that value outweighs any perceived benefits of global online access.
That is the ultimate act of human agency. But if a total blackout is one extreme, is there a sustainable middle ground? Something between that and the chaos of hyperconnectivity that allows for both economic integration and cultural integrity.
Yes, and this brings us to the crucial model of disciplined integration, which we can call the weaver's balance. It's exemplified by a weaver named Rina in a remote village in Nusa Tenggara. Her community provides a practical blueprint for sustainable digital development.
Tell me about Rina's solution. How did her community find this balance?
Well, Rina's community started using 4G strictly for economic survival. They leveraged the internet to connect to the global marketplace and sell their traditional tenon cloth directly to international buyers.
So they bypassed the exploitative middlemen and retained more profit.
Right. They use technology as a precise economic enhancer consistent with that principle we discussed earlier.
But the critical step was imposing the cultural boundary using their traditional law, their adat.
Absolutely. RINA instilled a community rule rooted in that customary law. They installed Wi-Fi in their communal working house, but they cut it off every single day at 5:00 p.m. without exception.
Every day.
Every day. This practice enforces what you could call a digital winter every evening. They reserve that evening time slot explicitly for cultural survival. It was designated as storytelling time.
That is genius. They are learning from their own history of minimal connectivity. The physical boundary of the timer in the sunset, it recreates the natural limits that the old Wartel era enforced. It forces them to prioritize the very friction that builds bonds.
It proves that communities don't have to choose between economic prosperity and cultural integrity. By actively looking back at the time before hyperconnectivity, RINA found a template for discipline access that is culturally dictated and boundary enforced.
So the community intentionally cultivates space for uniquely human interactions.
Listening to elders, absorbing culture, and most importantly, just simply being present with one another, this intentional cultivation of productive silence and presence is the essence of sustainable digital development. Integrated access that is dictated by human values, not digital convenience.
So to synthesize everything we've covered in this deep dive, from the cognitive anxiety of the urban user and the quantitative decline of social trust, all the way to the wisdom of the Baduy elders and the weaver, it seems the great paradox of our digital age is confirmed.
It is. The convenience of instant signal directly correlates with increased personal fatigue and, simultaneously, decreased communal trust.
The studies confirm it. The intensity of use causes burnout primarily through cognitive overload, demonstrating that managing our mental bandwidth is the real challenge.
And in parallel, the sheer ease and speed of digital communication have inadvertently eroded the generational practice of trust building, which requires that mandatory friction and presence.
That 5-minute sacred Wartel call, it was expensive, it was slow, it required physical effort, waiting in line, traveling to the building, being aware of that ticking meter. But those very characteristics, that necessary friction, that was what ensured the communication was intentional, deep, and sufficient for the week.
And what we've lost is not just a communication delay.
No, we've lost the fundamental friction required to build deep, authentic bonds that can withstand external pressure.
And the path to resilience, whether it's achieved through disciplined adaptation like in Wajo and Rina's village, or through complete restriction like the inner Baduy, it relies on one central, unavoidable theme: reestablishing human agency over technology.
Right. It means recognizing that digital efficiency, while it's seductive, does not equate to human flourishing or community strength.
And to build strong, supportive networks that can survive the rapid pace of technological change, we have to prioritize and actively cultivate those uniquely human skills: empathy, ethical reasoning, creativity, and critically active listening and presence.
Community resilience is a long-term investment.
It is. Every authentic connection cultivated contributes to a more resilient and flourishing world. And it does so by intentionally cultivating the necessary capacity for productive silence above the constant demand for digital efficiency.